Up until this point, we've really been talking about the manual aspect of how you're going to work with things from a field service perspective. So we've talked about how you can manually create work orders, and not even necessarily manually create work orders. We talked about how you could convert a work order from a case, or how you might work with things from there. But think about how an organization might work from inside their inner workings. You might be doing a lot of preventive maintenance for customers, and so you might set up how your work orders want to work on more of a predefined schedule. So for example, I might go out and maybe I have like a landscaping company. Well, in the summer months, I might go out and I might mow somebody's lawn or mow a corporation's lawn, once a week, and go out and now maybe do, landscape edging and some of the trimming of hedges and stuff like that once every couple of weeks. And then when it comes into the winter, I might actually only go out and service and do snow removal when it actually snows. And so from an agreement perspective, what it allows you to do is to set up and define specific schedules for how work orders might be created. So if we know that we're going to send somebody out once a week to mow a lawn, rather than having the dispatcher come in or having somebody come in and manually create those work orders, we can automatically create those work orders and generate those work orders using agreements, and we can generate them on a predefined schedule. We also have the capabilities to generate the bookings for those options automatically. And the nice thing about agreements is I could set up several different types of automated schedules within that scenario. So I could have a schedule that would be set up specifically for the lawn care aspect of it, and then maybe I have another one that is set up specifically for the edging and the trimming and doing the general landscaping information. And then when it comes time to snow and we just need to dispatch somebody out, we would still have the option to create those work orders manually. The other thing that's nice with agreements is they also give you the capabilities to handle invoicing and define when you want to invoice information inside the system. Now, with a combination of auto-generating the work orders and auto-generating the invoices, you now have a very flexible framework that you can work with. And the other thing that's nice with the agreements is they give you the capabilities to look at how you want to work with things even from a sales process standpoint. So in this module, what I want to do is just give you kind of an overview of agreements in general, how they work, how you set them up, and what are some of the things that you want to keep in mind inside the application when you're working with them. We're also going to walk you through and we'll create and maintain a couple of different agreements. So we'll set up some agreements and we'll show you how some of the different options around those agreements affect what's happening inside the application. We'll look at how you can auto-generate your bookings. So now you can set up and predefine the schedule for how you want the information to be auto-created inside the application. And then we'll also look at things like invoicing and talk a little bit about how invoices could potentially be generated inside the application as well. Now, we're not going to focus as much on invoicing as we will on some of the other options, but it's still important to understand that the invoicing aspect of agreements is a critical aspect in regards to what you might want to do as you're using agreements. At their most basic level, think of an agreement as almost like a framework. What I want to do when I build my agreement out is I want to define a framework for how I might trigger the auto creation of work orders and invoices inside the application. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to define, who the customer is, who the service account is that I want to work with, and then I'm going to define how regularly we're going to dispatch somebody out for specific types of incidences within the application. Now, at the beginning of the module, we talked a little bit about, the landscaping company, but think about any type of company that might be doing any type of preventative maintenance. We've talked about printer companies in the past. If I'm going to go out and I'm going to service printers, I'm probably going to do that, once every couple of months. So I would want to generate those work orders on those items. They really do serve their purpose most ideally in situations like preventative maintenance. But you can get very creative when you start working with agreements in any type of situation where you would really need somebody to go out and create some type of option on a predetermined schedule. So if you think about an agreement as a framework, let's talk about the key critical aspects that you're going to use when you create it. So the foundation of an agreement is understanding who who you're going to be providing that work for. So as you can see here on the slide, we still have the same concepts of the billing and the service accounts. So you're still going to define who the service account is for the agreement, as well as who's handling the billing information. And then you're also going to set up and define the duration of that agreement. So just like any contract that you might be having with a customer, you're going to have start and end dates that are associated with this. So once you create these agreements, they will come in kind of a status where they're not necessarily active inside the system. Once you activate them, now those agreements will allow you to actually have it auto-generate and start creating those work orders on a predefined schedule when you're working through it. Now, depending upon what the situation is, obviously each agreement is going to have pricing information associated with it as well as a service territory, so it understands where that customer might be in the grand scheme of things. And so when you're setting up the first part of the agreement, you're really just setting up the framework. The stuff like the booking creations and the invoice setup, that's all going to be an additional piece that's going to come in kind of after the fact. So let's hop into the application and let's create an agreement and then walk you through some of the ins and outs from it from inside the application. So if I go into field service and I go into agreements, this will take me in and show me all of the active agreements that I have inside the system itself. And we'll just go ahead and kind of create one from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on New. I'm going to specify my service account. So in this case, we know that we're going to be working with Alpine Ski House. And just like we did with work orders, it's going to pre-populate the billing account with that information. Now the system status will come in and we have a couple of different options. So think of your agreements as having a life cycle. When you first create them and as you're getting everything set up and being able to work in, they're going to come in as really an estimate. So they're not active within the system, which means it's not going to auto start generating any of these bookings and any of these work order options based upon those situations. Once you activate the agreement, then it's going to go in and it's going to start triggering that functionality inside the system. Now, once an agreement reaches its conclusion, then it can go into an expired status where it's not going to continue to generate or auto-generate those bookings and those invoices inside the system. And then ultimately, at some point in time, if the customer or you as an organization decide that you want to discontinue the agreement as a whole, obviously you can cancel the agreement as you're working through it. Now, we're going to look at this from a standpoint of how we want to initially work through it. So we're going to just set this up as kind of an estimate. But just like any other scenario, like work orders, like bookings or any of those options, we do have the capabilities to work with the concept of substatuses in here as well if you're looking to define additional details that might break things down a little bit more further in regards to that option. Now, when we get into the actual agreement details itself, this is where you're going to define kind of the contract standpoint for the agreement itself. So in this case, when do we know that this agreement's going to start? Well, we'll just go ahead and start this agreement today. We'll end this agreement 1 year from today, so we'll end this on the 1st of 2017. And we'll see that the duration will auto-populate. So it'll look at the information that you've put in there and then auto-populate the duration based upon those options. If I wanted to add some additional details about this agreement just for people who would be consuming this inside the application, I could go in and define some predetermined details for this just so they have some additional information. Now the next thing that you'll see in here is the ability to work with sales information. So one of the nice things about agreements as well is they can be added as part of your sales process. So agreements can be tied to opportunities, and they can be tied to quotes as well as sales orders. So for example, you could be selling your service agreements as part of your organization, and you could attach them as line items to that particular work order. So when you generate it from a work order perspective, now you would have the capabilities to have these agreements be associated with those items. So what you're seeing in here is this is really showing you any, when it talks about sales contracts, any orders that this is associated with, as well as any quotes that this is associated with. Now again, you might have a scenario where you have multiple agreements. So if you have kind of a sub-agreement of another area, this is where I could come in here, and if I have an originating agreement, I could now specify where that original agreement came from inside the application. But obviously, ultimately, we're going to be building and billing this information as part of the individualized work orders, so we're going to need to have a price list associated associated with this. So I'm going to go ahead and specify my default price list for this particular option. I'm then going to specify whether or not I want to use a service territory, and if so, what service territory does this agreement participate in. That service territory is going to transfer over to the work orders once the work orders are auto-created within the system. Am I going to be taxing this information? And if so, what sales tax code do I want to use? So if I have any sales tax codes set up within the application, I could utilize those. We'll just go ahead and leave that as non-taxable for now, just for demonstration purposes. Now I have my agreement ready to go. So now I can go ahead and hit save. And once I save this, now you'll see over on the right-hand side my booking and my invoice setup. So this is where I can now start determining how I want this information to regularly populate inside the application to start generating those work orders and then the subsequent items that are going to work with those. The next piece to this, as we talked about, is the agreement and the bookings, or the bookings and the invoices. And we're going to talk about them kind of intermixed, but we'll look at them kind of separately inside the application. Think about, how you might be working within the concept of any type of company that's doing preventative maintenance. If I might be sending somebody out, let's look at the landscaping company again. I might be sending somebody out once a week. So I'm going to send somebody out once a week to actually go through and perform that service for that customer. But at the same point in time, from an invoicing standpoint, I'm not going to invoice you after every individual time. I'm probably just going to invoice you once a month because you're making a predefined determination from that. So this is where I can now have separate bookings set up for the individual service tasks that we want to use to generate the work orders, and then I can have separate invoice set up to generate those invoices once a month from that standpoint. And within the bookings, I could have, like I said, multiple bookings within those situations. Now, where this is really kind of handy is inside the individual situations, I can do things like populate incident types, and I can populate service tasks. So I can automatically have the application take that information in, and so when it creates the work order, much like we did when we manually created the work order, we can have it pre-populate that information. So what I want to do now is I want to take you into the application, and we'll set up a couple of different bookings and invoices so you can see what that looks like inside and how that is consumed from inside the application. So I'm in my agreement that we created for Alpine Ski House. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a booking. So I'm going to go into my booking setups and I'm going to hit add. And this is going to open up my booking setup. So as I come into here, this is where I'm going to define the specific information that I have around that. So what do I want to call this? So maybe we'll just call this monthly MRI. Monthly MRI inspection. So the first thing that you'll see down here is the work order settings. So this is going to allow us to determine whether or not we want to auto-generate the work order based upon this booking, or whether we want to manually generate the work order. You have both options. So if you would rather you create the work orders based upon those agreement, you certainly would have the capabilities to do that. In this case, I want to auto-generate the work orders. So this is where I'm going to look at how I want to define what those work orders are going to get generated. The next thing that you have is what type of work order is this? So obviously this is going to be some type of situation inside the application. Because I'm doing MRI inspections, we're just going to call this preventative, we're going to call this an inspection. So we'll set the work order type to inspection. Now we want to define how many days in advance we want this to happen. So depending upon when we're going to schedule this, if we're going to schedule it once a week or if we're going to schedule it once a month, we want to have that information automatically pre-populate based upon those scenarios. So maybe from a dispatching perspective, I want that to be created 3 days in advance, so the dispatcher has time to get it onto the schedule board and then kind of predetermine what they want to do from there. So in this situation, I can go ahead and I can define how many days in advance I want that to work with. Now, from a priority standpoint, we've talked about priorities in the past, but remember, priorities are when some of your resource optimization capabilities, where it's going to start taking things into consideration, and things with a higher priority can be scheduled sooner than things with a lower priority in the system. So when we generate this work order, if we want that work order to generate with a higher priority, this is where we could go in and we could define what specific priority options we want to use, and then based upon those ratings, it's going to bring things in with a higher priority based upon those options. Now in this case, I don't necessarily need to use any of these specific options, so I'm just going to go ahead and just clear out this particular value for now, and we'll kind of leave it from that standpoint. So the next option that you see in here is to auto-generate the booking. So we can auto-generate the work order. That's not a problem. We can have the work order get created. If we choose not to auto-generate the booking, the work order is going to get created and not be scheduled by default. So on the schedule board, it's going to look into our unscheduled area, and it's going to show as an item that's waiting to be scheduled. If at the same time I want this to generate the booking for that particular option, I would be able to go ahead and predefine the booking that I wanted to work with as well and have it create the booking automatically for me. And then based upon this is where I could define the estimated duration. So if I know that it's roughly going to take about 2 hours, I could define that it should take about 2 hours to complete this work order, and that would get attached to the booking, so the booking would be created for 2 hours. The pre-booking and post-booking flexibility allows us to determine if there's a specified amount of days that we want to use from a flexibility standpoint. So if you think about it in terms of like when you've booked flights in the past, that asks you if you have any play in regards to your travel schedule. So that looks at, flights that might be 1 or 2 days prior to what you've chosen. It's the same type of situation here. We want it to be, on this specific day, but do I have some flexibility both from a pre and a post booking flexibility to allow myself some leeway on either aspect? Now, if I choose to generate the bookings automatically, so if I do choose to auto-generate the booking itself, one of the things that I have to do is I have to define the preferred resource. So who is going to be the person that we ultimately would want to be able to take place in this situation as part of that scenario? So this is where I can look at all of my individual resources inside the system, and I could predefine the resource that we want to use for this option. So I know that Derek is the one that primarily does our MRI inspections. He's the one that I'm going to use. If I wanted to use the scheduling assistant, or if I was going to use resource optimization to be able to maybe pick a more appropriate resource, I would in this case probably just not auto-generate the booking. I would have the work order get created, and then I would use some of the scheduling assistance or resource optimization to be able to define the resource specifically. In this case, I know the customer prefers Derek. Derek does have the skill set. I'm going to go ahead and use Derek. And then you can specify a time window and an end window. So when do we look at from a starting and an ending time? What type of time frame are we looking at to allow this booking to be created? And then is there a predetermined start time that we want to use for these individual options? So this is where you can kind of define what those situations look like inside the application. Now when you hit save, then it's going to go out and it's going to save this booking. Now, if I had not determined a preferred start time, I would have gotten an error message that's let me know that you have to have a start time. So you don't necessarily have to populate in the time window start and end options. That just gives it a little bit more predefined flexibility. But you do need to have, if you choose to auto-generate the booking, you do need to have a preferred start time that's associated with that, so it knows that where it can kind of start looking at things from a scheduling perspective for that person. So now you've got your incidents. So this is where you can start looking at incident types that you want to associate with this particular booking arrangement. So now I can go ahead and I can click on Add. And this is where I can pick my incident type that I want to use. So in this case, I know it's going to be an MRI inspection. This is where I can now start adding that information into here. I can also, if I have a customer asset, so if this particular customer has an MRI machine that I am going to be inspecting, and we've cataloged that as a customer asset, I would now be able to associate that with the customer asset directly within here, so I could work with it from that standpoint. Then I would be able to go ahead and hit Save and Close. And it would associate this with that particular incident type inside the application. Now, in addition to that, I would also have the capabilities to pre-populate in things like service tasks, products, and services. So if I didn't necessarily want to use incident types, I would have the capabilities to go in and just say, okay, here's the service tasks that are involved in this, and I could manually add each individual service task. I could also do the same thing for products and or services. That way, when it generates the work order inside the system, it's going to auto-configure that information information based upon those items. Now, the other thing that you have in here is, when do I want to start actually performing this service? And so what are the booking dates that we're going to use to start kind of predefining when these things are going to get auto-generated in the system? And so that's where this booking date option comes into play. So when I come in here and I create my booking dates, this is where I'm going to basically create kind of a reoccurring schedule for this individual option. So this is where now I'm going to define, what is the resource that I want to use for this booking date. So I'm going to go ahead and say Derek. What's the booking date that we want to use for this particular option? So we'll go ahead and pick the first initial booking date. So we'll say Monday within that scenario. We'll choose what booking setup we're going to use. It's going to use our MRI inspection. Now we can go ahead and save it. And now I can have it go ahead and generate the work order based upon this particular option, or I can have the system kind of create it automatically. What's happening in this scenario is, if I generate this option for here, I am manually creating that work order. So I'm saying that this work order is going to be manually created based upon those options. So this would be very beneficial in situations where I chose not to auto-create the work orders. The other option that you would have, and I'm just going to delete that out so we can show you the other option. The other option would be to use booking reoccurrence. So from a booking reoccurrence perspective, now I can have the system kind of do this for me and say, okay, when do I want to start generating these bookings inside the system, and how do I want the work orders to be created from that perspective? So when I open this up, it's going to generate my rescheduling option. So I'm going to define when I want this information to take place. So in this case, I want it to take place every week. I want it to start on Monday. When do I want it to start? So I'm going to start on December 5th. Do I have an end date? Do I want this to, how long, or what's the duration of this particular contract or item that we're working with? So I do know that I have an end by date, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit end by date, and I will choose December 1st of 2017. Now, if I wanted to define custom dates for this, I would be able to go ahead and add or work with custom dates from here. But in this case, I'll just go ahead and leave it the way I have it. So I know it's going to start on the 5th. It's going to end by the 1st. We'll go ahead and save and close. And then once I activate this agreement inside the application, it will then start auto-generating these booking options. And so then what will happen is, in the booking dates, I will actually see them get populated as they get created inside as part of the agreement that we've worked with. Invoices work very similar in the same type of retrospect in regards to how they auto-populate and generate. There isn't quite as much information that you have to capture when you're working through the invoice options, but you do need to consider things about how things are going to be brought out into that invoicing perspective to make sure that the invoice is including the additional items that may need to work through it. So from an invoicing perspective, it's a standpoint of just going in and adding your invoice setup. It's going to ask you what you want to call this particular name here. So we'll call this MRI monthly invoice. We're going to associate it with that particular agreement. We'll hit save. And then once we save that, now I can go into here and I can do just like we did from the other option. I can define my invoicing reoccurrence. And here's where I can set up how often I want these invoices to be generated as part of this maintenance agreement. Now, it's not necessary. I still would need to define specific actions around the invoice and those items. This is just going to create the invoice record. The dollar amounts and the items would have to kind of come in from what the individual work orders and items would be defined from that. But this is just going to trigger kind of the invoice functionality. It's not necessarily, it's just create the schedule around creating it, but it's the same type of process. So I want it to basically come out on the first day of every month. I want it to start on, let's say, December 30th of 2016, and I want it to end by, let's say, November 30th of 2017. And then save. Now, In this situation, once you've gone in and you've defined what those individual situations are, then you can go ahead and once you work through it, it'll start reoccurring and creating those individual invoices. Again, there's additional items, and we'll talk about that in some of the inventory module around what that invoicing process looks like, but now you can see how you would work through that. So now that I've got my invoicing options and my booking options set up, if I wanted to, I could set up another, booking option based upon that situation, and I could have multiple, booking schedules set up for individual types of maintenance that we would be working through. The final piece to this is now I'm going to go ahead and activate this agreement. And by activating this agreement, now it's going to trigger the functionality inside the system to have this information start pre-populating based upon those options. Now, as you work through this and as you're going through, if a customer decides to re-up with this information in the past, you would now have the capabilities to go into your agreement, hit copy agreement, and now here this is where you could create a copy of this agreement. You could now move it over into the next year, and then you could start moving things forward from there. So these agreements are a great way that you can kind of predefine information and have some of this information be auto-created inside the application. Agreements may not necessarily be the first thing that you're going to create as part of your field service implementation, but they're definitely something that's going to become a part of it as you move forward. Typically, you're going to create the structure and have all of your organizational stuff predefined ahead of time. And once you've started creating work orders, now you can start adding agreements for that automation process. And that's really the key point of why you would use agreements inside the application. And so in this module, we really looked at, how do you work with agreements in general, and how do they work when you want to define the items from a schedule. And remember that that's the entire purpose of an agreement, is to allow you to automatically generate work orders and or bookings and invoices on a specified schedule based upon your needs. The other thing that's nice is if you're using your sales process and you're selling these agreements as part of your sales process, these agreements do have the capabilities to be associated with quotes, orders, and opportunities, so you can use that information when you're driving forward. So it does give you that flexibility to associate them within the application as well. And then the final thing, we've talked about it multiple times, but just remember that once you create that agreement can have multiple schedules associated with it to really provide you with that extra level of flexibility based upon how you might be servicing your customers moving forward.